think I didn't do anything wrong, just followed my heart where it wanted to go. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Me standing in the airport with my phone flashing, number disconnected. I thought he'd be angry, maybe hurt, but not gone. Not like this. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I think I didn't do anything wrong, just wanted to feel alive again. That's what I kept telling myself while I scrolled through old pictures of Ethan. The way he smiled like the world owed him sunlight. The way he looked at me before life became about bills and bedtime routines. Caleb never looked at me like that anymore. He looked at me like a task he had already completed. Our house always smelled like detergent and quiet. Caleb liked things clean and predictable. I said once that the walls looked like an instruction manual. He said that was the point. Clarity kept chaos away. I laughed and said chaos was where the good stories happened. He didn't laugh. He just kept reading his shipping reports, nodding now and then like my words were weather, passing and harmless. I'm 33, a travel blogger who hasn't traveled much lately. Caleb is 36, a logistics coordinator who schedules everything, including feelings, I think. Our daughter Ivy is 7 and sweet, always asking if I'm happy. I tell her of course I am, but the truth is I feel like someone pressed pause on my life years ago. It started small. I reconnected with Ethan through social media, an old flame from when I studied abroad in Paris. He commented on one of my posts about wanderlust, saying he missed that spark I used to have. I told him marriage had a way of making sparks practical. He replied, "Sparks should never be practical." The message stayed in my head for weeks. When Caleb came home that night, he asked why I was smiling at my phone. I said Jessie had sent a meme. He said Jessie didn't usually make me blush. I told him not to be jealous. It wasn't a good look on him. He said he wasn't jealous, just curious. I said curiosity was exhausting. He didn't argue. That's what made him infuriating. He never fought back, never gave me the drama that would justify my guilt. I started posting more pictures of myself. Nothing scandalous, just artistic. Ethan liked everyone. Jessie, my best friend, said I looked liberated. She said Caleb was holding me back, that women like me weren't meant for small lives. I told her I had responsibilities. She said responsibility was a word invented to trap women. I laughed, but I didn't disagree. Caleb suggested we take a family trip to Europe that summer. I thought it was sweet until he said it would be structured for Ivy's sake. I told him he sucked the fun out of everything. He said vacations weren't supposed to create debt. I said some experiences were priceless. He said so were stable homes. I told him he made everything sound like an invoice. He just smiled and said, "You'll like Paris again." That night, after he fell asleep, I messaged Ethan. I told him we might be in Europe soon. He said, "Then the city will finally feel alive again." I felt a rush, like something was waking up inside me that had been asleep for years. I told myself it wasn't cheating if nothing happened. When I mentioned to Caleb that I might need a solo work week for my blog, he didn't object. He said I could stay behind for extra content if I wanted. I was shocked. I said, "You trust me that much?" He said, "I trust you enough to make your own choices." I should have been touched. Instead, I was irritated. I told Jessie about it, and she said he was testing me. She said if I wanted him to care, I'd have to make him afraid of losing me. I didn't plan to test him, but the idea sat in the back of my mind like a dare. Over dinner one evening, I brought up Paris. I said it was the city where I first felt like myself. Caleb said he remembered. I asked if he thought I'd changed. He said everyone changes. I said not everyone fades. He said maybe I was chasing ghosts. I told him maybe ghosts understood me better. He said ghosts don't stay. I said maybe that's why they're exciting. He didn't respond, just continued eating, which somehow made me angrier. Later that night, Ivy drew a picture of our family with little flags above each head. England for Caleb, France for me, a heart between us. She said it was for the trip. Caleb smiled, but I couldn't. The heart looked too perfect, too permanent. I tucked the drawing away and told her it was beautiful. When I told Jessie about the trip plans, she said I should use it to find closure. I said closure was overrated. She said maybe I wanted a new beginning. She wasn't wrong. I messaged Ethan again that night. Paris in June. Maybe we should talk. He replied almost instantly. I'll be waiting. Over the next few days, Caleb became quieter. He asked if I was still excited about the trip. I said yes, but he looked unconvinced. He said he was glad we'd get family time. I said family time was overrated too. He said maybe I was just tired. I told him not to psychoanalyze me. He said he wasn't. I told him then, stop acting like he knew me better than I knew myself. He said he'd stop trying. The night before booking the flights, I stood by the window while Caleb balanced the budget at the kitchen table. He asked how long I'd need in Paris. I said maybe a week, maybe more. It depended on the content. He nodded and said, I'll plan accordingly. That calmness again, like nothing could shake him. It made me want to do something reckless just to prove I could still surprise him. When I finally booked the trip, I added a note in my planner. London, family, Paris, myself. It felt poetic. I told myself it wasn't betrayal. It was rebirth. That night, as I packed Ivy's passport beside mine, I stared at Caleb's name printed next to mine on the itinerary. The letters looked wrong together, mismatched. I thought about Ethan's message again. I'll be waiting. I whispered it out loud to the dark kitchen and smiled. Caleb stirred in the next room, but I didn't stop smiling. I'd already decided who I wanted to be when I landed in Paris, and it wasn't his wife. The trip began smoothly, almost too smoothly. Caleb was in one of his practical moods, the kind where he treated logistics like affection. He double-checked passports, confirmed hotel bookings, and packed extra snacks for Ivy. I told him he was overdoing it. He said preparation prevented panic. I told him he was allergic to spontaneity. He smiled and said, "You'd be surprised what I can handle." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help noticing how calm he looked, almost like someone who already knew the ending of a story I hadn't started yet. In London, things felt bearable. The city distracted me with noise and colour. Caleb planned tours, museums, little restaurants with family menus. I posted pictures of cobblestone streets and captioned them collecting moments. Ethan commented with a single word, "Beautiful." Jessie replied with heart emojis. Caleb noticed the notification, but didn't say anything. That silence felt louder than any argument could have been. One evening, after Ivy fell asleep, Caleb asked if I was excited for Paris. I said it would be good for my work. He said, "For work or for closure?" I asked what that meant. He said, "You've been talking about Paris a lot lately, and not about us." I told him he was imagining problems. He said maybe he just noticed patterns. I said patterns were boring. He said stability was another word for safety. I told him safety was suffocating. He said, "Maybe you're confusing safety with love." I didn't answer. A few days later, while we walked through Hyde Park, I pretended to take photos of swans, but was really texting Ethan. "Almost there," I wrote. He replied, "Can't wait to see you. It's been too long." I smiled at my screen. Caleb looked over and asked if Jessie was being funny again. I said yes. He nodded and kept walking, pushing Ivy's stroller. That patience, so gentle, so quiet, suddenly looked pathetic to me. I thought, he deserves this. He needs to see what it's like when someone stops orbiting him. That night, over dinner, I told Caleb I'd confirmed the work extension in Paris. He said he'd already booked the return flight for him and Ivy 1 week earlier, so I could have time alone. I said he'd assumed too much. He said, "You needed freedom. I'm giving it to you. He didn't say it cruelly, which somehow made it worse. Jesse messaged me later, he's testing you, don't blink first. I wrote back, he won't leave me, he's too steady for that. She sent laughing emojis. Our last morning together before Paris, we took a family photo near the Tower Bridge. Caleb set the timer and wrapped his arm around me. I smiled for the camera because Ivy was watching. When the photo clicked, he whispered, "Remember this one." I asked what he meant. He said, "Sometimes pictures outlast people." I told him that was a weird thing to say. He just looked out at the river and said, "Enjoy Paris, Aveline. I hope you find what you're chasing." At Heathrow, he walked me to the gate. Ivy hugged me tight and asked if I'd bring back something from France. I said, of course. Caleb said, "Don't miss your flight back." I said, "Don't worry, I won't." He smiled faintly and said, "We'll see." I thought it was sarcasm. Now I know it wasn't. On the plane, I felt light, almost electric. Ethan messaged that he'd picked me up from the airport. He said he'd booked a little cafe near Montmartre for lunch. He told me to wear something that made me feel like the girl he used to know. I wore the yellow dress Caleb hated because he said it wrinkled too easily. When the plane landed, I didn't check my messages from Caleb. I told myself he could wait. Paris looked exactly like it did years ago. Loud, dramatic, promising. Ethan was at the arrivals gate, wearing sunglasses indoors. He smiled like the past had been waiting for me all along. He hugged me, said I looked untouched by time. I said he looked more real than memory. We laughed at our own cliches. At lunch, he ordered wine and said, "So you really came?" I said, "Of course I did." He said, "You're still married." I said, "Only technically." He said, "Technically matters more than you think." I said, "Not to me." He raised his glass and said, "Then to freedom." That night, he invited me to his place, said it would be easier to talk privately. I went, telling myself it was just closure. He showed me his studio, his guitars, his unfinished songs. He said one of them was about me. I said he shouldn't have stopped writing. He said, "You shouldn't have stopped living." It sounded like poetry, but underneath it was judgment. When I got back to my hotel, I had 8 missed calls from Caleb. I ignored them. I told myself he'd calm down. Jesse texted, "You did it, finally." I didn't reply. Something about the silence in that hotel room didn't feel like freedom. It felt like absence. The next morning, Ethan was distant. He said he had rehearsal. I said, "Maybe we could meet later." He said, "We'll see." The phrase echoed the one Caleb had used at the airport. It made my stomach twist. That night, I posted a picture of the Eiffel Tower with the caption, "Reclaiming Old Dreams." It got hundreds of likes. One comment stood out, from an anonymous account. "Dreams don't pay for consequences." I deleted it immediately, but the words lingered. By the 3rd day, Ethan stopped replying altogether. My calls went straight to voicemail. I told myself he was busy, but the truth crawled under my skin. I tried to message Caleb instead, just to check in. It didn't go through. I tried again. Still nothing. At first, I thought the Wi-Fi was bad. Then I realized I couldn't find him on any social platform either. His number showed disconnected. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a mistake. I emailed him, no reply. I checked our shared bank app, locked out. My card declined at the cafe. That evening, as Paris lights flickered outside my hotel window, I tried one last call. It rang once, then cut off. The automated voice said, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." I sat there holding the phone, staring at my reflection in the dark glass. For the first time, I felt like the one left behind. And for the first time, I realized Caleb's silence wasn't patience. It was strategy. For the first few hours, I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe Caleb had changed his SIM card. Maybe the bank app was glitching. I was still in Paris after all. Everything felt temporary there. I walked along the Seine, trying to look carefree for my followers, but my chest hurt. I captioned a picture. Sometimes you have to lose the map to find yourself. It felt clever until I realized I actually was lost. That night, I tried calling Clara. She didn't answer. I tried my sister, Ria, instead. She picked up on the third ring, sounding cautious. I said, "Can you tell Caleb I've been trying to reach him?" There was silence. Then she said, "He's home." I asked what she meant. She said, "He came back yesterday, alone." My stomach dropped. I said, "Where's Ivy?" She said, "With him." I said, "Why didn't he wait for me?" She said, "Why would he?" I hung up. I told myself he was punishing me, that this was his little power game. I called Jessie for advice. She said he was bluffing, that men like him always crawl back once they realize how dependent they are. I wanted to believe her, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, I went to the airline counter to ask if there were any flight changes on our reservation. The clerk checked her screen, frowning. "Your return leg has been cancelled," she said. I laughed, said it must be a mistake. She printed a confirmation. "Booking closed by primary account holder." I asked who that was. She pointed to the name, Caleb Cross. I walked outside into the bright Paris sunlight that suddenly felt cruel. My phone buzzed with an email from my blogging sponsor. Notice: contract under review pending reputation inquiry. I opened social media. My comments were flooded with speculation. "Where's your husband? Did he leave you in Europe?" Someone had posted screenshots of my earlier captions alongside Ethan's tagged photos. I hadn't even realized I'd been tagged. I called Ethan, straight to voicemail. I left a message saying we needed to talk, that things had gotten complicated. I waited an hour, then another. Nothing. When I checked his Instagram, his account had gone private. By evening, panic turned to rage. I sent Caleb a long email. "This is childish. You don't get to disappear. We are adults. I deserve an explanation." I hit send, but the message bounced back, address disabled. He'd even closed his email. I stared at the error message until the words blurred. That night, I checked into a cheaper hotel, since my card still wouldn't work and I had to pay in cash. I told myself it was temporary, a reset. I posted a filtered photo of my wine glass and wrote, "Freedom tastes bitter before it's sweet." The likes came slower than usual. Jessie commented a heart. No one else did. The next morning, Ria called. Her voice was tight. She said, "Aveline, you need to come home." I said I was already planning to. She said, "You might want to check your mail before you do." I asked what she meant. She said, "Clara received something from a lawyer." I asked whose lawyer. She said, "Caleb's." I started to laugh, but it came out wrong, like choking. I left Paris that same night. I didn't even tell Ethan. On the flight, I stared at the empty seat beside me, imagining Caleb sitting there, arms crossed, silent but composed. That was his style, quiet destruction. When I landed in Seattle, the house key didn't work. I stood on the porch at 3 a.m, tapping the handle like it might open out of pity. A new padlock gleamed under the porch light. I knocked, though I knew he wasn't inside. The windows were dark. I checked my phone again, hoping for a message, but instead there was a new email from M. Sibel and Associates. The subject line read, "Notice of legal action." I opened it, hands trembling. The message was short, a formal acknowledgement that Caleb Cross had filed for separation, citing abandonment and reputational harm. It included phrases like asset protection and custody arrangements. I dropped the phone onto the porch. I slept in my car outside our driveway. The next morning, Clara came out to collect the mail. She froze when she saw me. I rolled down the window, smiling too brightly. I said, "Can you tell him I'm back?" She said, "He knows." I said, "Then why isn't he here?" She said, "Because you left first." I told her I'd only gone for a week. She said, "Some absences last longer than that." She placed a letter on the hood of my car and walked away. It was from Marta Bell, his lawyer. Inside were copies of documents, my posts, my texts, even Ethan's photos printed with timestamps. I wanted to scream that it was invasive, unfair, cruel, but deep down I knew Caleb didn't hack anything. I had given him all the evidence myself, one post at a time. When I drove to Jessie's apartment, she wasn't there. She'd gone out of town. I texted her what happened. Hours later, she replied, "He's overreacting. You'll talk him down. Just cry a little if you have to." That night, I stayed at Ria's. She kept looking at me like she wanted to say something but didn't. Finally, she said, "I saw the pictures, Avi. You didn't just talk to your ex." I told her it wasn't like that. She said, "Then what was it like?" I said, "I just needed to remember who I was." She said, "You remembered too much." When she went to bed, I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. Every trace of Caleb was gone. Blocked numbers, removed tags, even old photos unshared. I tried searching his name. Nothing. He'd erased himself completely, not with rage but precision. I whispered to the dark room that I hadn't done anything wrong. The silence disagreed. The next morning, Ria set a cup of coffee in front of me and said I should talk to a lawyer before doing anything else. I told her she was being dramatic. She said Caleb wasn't the kind of man who acted without reason. That stung because it was true. When he stayed quiet, it meant he was already 10 steps ahead. I said, maybe this was just a scare tactic. She said legal papers weren't for scaring. They were for ending. I drove to the house again anyway. It looked smaller somehow, like it had already learned to forget me. The curtains were drawn, the garden trimmed. My own plants were gone, replaced by neutral pots. I knocked, even though I knew no one would answer. Clara's car was in the driveway. She opened the door before I could knock again. She said, "You can't just keep showing up." I said, "It's still my house." She said, "Not anymore." I laughed because the words didn't make sense. She handed me another envelope. "He wanted this delivered in person," she said. I told her she was enjoying this. She said, "I don't enjoy watching families fall apart, especially when they don't have to." Inside the envelope was another letter from Marta Bell's office. It confirmed that Caleb had filed for temporary custody of Ivy and restricted joint access to all financial accounts. The phrasing was cold, to ensure stability and protection of minor. I called him again. The number still didn't work. Back in the car, I messaged Jessie. "He's really doing it." She replied, "Then you need to get ahead of it." She said I should control the narrative before he painted me as the villain. I said, "What do I say?" She said, "Say you left to find yourself, and he turned it into punishment." It sounded good in theory. That night, I posted a picture from Paris I hadn't used yet. Me at a cafe, the Eiffel Tower blurred in the background. The caption read, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself." Within minutes, the comments came. Some people said they admired me. Others called me selfish. I replied to one saying, "Marriage isn't a cage." Then I saw a new comment appear from an account with no profile picture. "Not a cage. Just a promise you broke." I deleted it. An hour later, I got an email from Marta again. "Please refrain from public commentary that may misrepresent ongoing proceedings." My hands shook. How did they see it so fast? I deleted the post immediately, but the damage was done. People had screenshotted it. I tried calling Jessie, but she didn't answer. Probably asleep or pretending to be. I ended up driving to Clara's house. I don't even know what I planned to say. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She said, "You need to stop digging deeper." I said I just wanted to see my daughter. She said that could be arranged through proper channels. I said, "She's my child." She said, "Then act like her mother, not her shadow." Her words hit harder than I wanted them to. I told her she had no right to talk to me like that. She said she was only saying what everyone else was too polite to. I left before I started crying. At Ria's, the air felt heavy. She said, "You have to face that he's not bluffing." I said, "He'll come around once I explain." She said, "You don't explain after legal filings, Avelaine. You respond." She found a local lawyer online, printed the contact info, and handed it to me. The next morning, I sat in the waiting room of Marta Bell's office, clutching my own stack of papers like a shield. When the receptionist told me Marta would see me, I felt a strange calm. I told myself I'd make her see how unfair this was. Marta was nothing like I expected. Soft voice, no judgment in her eyes. She asked if I understood why Caleb had taken these steps. I said he was trying to punish me for being independent. She said, "He's trying to protect himself legally." I said that was the same thing. She said, "Not in the eyes of the court." I said I just wanted my family back. She said that wasn't her role. She explained what abandonment meant in legal terms. The word sounded too big, too final. She asked if I had left with the intention to return. I said yes. She asked if I told Caleb when I would. I said no. She said, "That distinction matters." I wanted to argue, but my voice cracked instead. She slid a folder across the desk and said, "You'll need your own counsel. This is a notice of upcoming hearings." Inside were copies of my public posts, my tagged photos and travel receipts, all underlined. She said, "He's being methodical, not cruel. That's usually more dangerous." When I walked out of the office, I felt like I'd stepped out of a story I wasn't the main character in anymore. Outside, Ria texted. "How did it go?" I replied. "He's serious," she said. "Then stop pretending you aren't." That evening, I sat in my car outside what used to be our house. The windows glowed softly from the inside. I could see shadows moving, Caleb's broad shape, Ivy's smaller one bouncing near the couch. He lifted her up, twirled her, and she laughed. It was faint, but I could hear it through the window. I knocked once, just to see if he'd look. He didn't. He probably knew I was there. Maybe that was part of the plan, to let me watch what I'd traded away. When I drove back to Ria's, the headlights caught the envelope still sitting on the passenger seat. I opened it again, reading the words that no longer sounded like fiction. Temporary custody granted. Property access restricted. I stared at the word temporary. It looked small, harmless, reversible. I told myself that was proof this wasn't over. But the truth whispered underneath it, that temporary was just the first step toward permanent. The hearing notice arrived a week later, printed on thick paper that smelled faintly of ink and consequence. I didn't even open it right away. I just stared at the envelope, pretending it was another bill or an ad, something easy to ignore. But when Ria found it on the counter, she said, "You can't delay this anymore." I told her I wasn't afraid. She said, "Then act like it." I finally tore it open. The court date was in 5 days. Attached was a list of evidence Caleb's lawyer planned to submit, emails, financial statements, and publicly available digital materials. I recognized the phrasing from Marta's earlier warning. It meant my own words would testify against me. I met with a lawyer named Drew Carter, who looked too young to be real. He read the documents quietly while I talked, about love, about misunderstandings, about how Caleb had trapped me. He didn't look up until I stopped. Then he said, "You need to understand what this looks like from the outside." I asked what he meant. He said, "You left the country to see an ex, posted about it, and now your husband has custody of your child. Emotion doesn't win against evidence." I told him Caleb was cold, manipulative, calculating. He said, "He's organized." That's not the same thing. I wanted to scream at him, but his calm was too much like Caleb's. He gave me a checklist. Documents I'd need, records to prove I hadn't abandoned my family. I didn't have half of them. That night, I sat in Ria's guest room surrounded by papers that didn't add up to anything. I tried to write a statement about finding myself, but every sentence sounded self-centered. I threw the notebook across the room. When I picked it up, Ivy's name fell out of my head and onto the paper like a wound. The next day, I drove to Clara's house again. I wanted to see Ivy, even for a minute. Clara opened the door before I knocked. She said, "You're making this harder for yourself." I said, "I'm her mother." She said, "Then stop fighting like a stranger." I said, "He's turning her against me." She said, "No, she just sees what's happening." Her voice didn't shake. That steadiness made me hate her. I went back to my car and cried so hard I couldn't see the steering wheel. When my phone buzzed, I thought it might be Caleb. It wasn't. It was Jessie. She finally texted back after a week of silence. "You okay?" Heard things got ugly. I wrote, "He's ruining my life." She replied, "He's protecting his own." That's what people are saying. I asked what she meant. She said, "The screenshots, AV. Everyone's seen them." I went online and saw it. Someone had compiled my posts, Ethan's photos, even one of Caleb's old comments from years ago, and captioned it, "When self-love turns into self-destruction." It had thousands of views. Comments ranged from pity to disgust. One said, "She left her husband and kid for a man who didn't want her." Another said, "She's learning the difference between freedom and fallout." I slammed the laptop shut. That evening, my lawyer called. He said Caleb's team had offered a settlement proposal. Partial custody after a 6-month review, no spousal support, no access to the shared accounts. I told him that was unacceptable. He said, "It's generous considering." I said, "Generous?" He took everything. He said, "You gave him everything to take." I hung up. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept picturing Caleb calmly sorting through documents, stapling proof of my mistakes while I sat here unraveling. Around 3 a.m., I drove to the house again. Lights were off. The lock still new. I left a note in the mailbox, short and pathetic. "I still love you. Please talk to me." The next morning, a delivery van stopped in front of Ria's place. The driver asked for my signature and handed me a sealed folder. Inside was a formal letter from Marta Bell's office. The first line read, "All communication must proceed through legal channels. Personal contact attempts will be treated as violations." The second line hurt worse. "Your client, Mr. Cross, has declined mediation." I called Drew in a panic. He said this meant Caleb wanted a full hearing, not a negotiation. I said he couldn't just erase me. He said, "He's not erasing you. He's redefining your role." Later, Ria came home with groceries and found me staring at my phone. She said, "You look like someone waiting for a miracle." I said, "He's going to regret this." She said, "No, Avi, he already regretted it. That's why he left." That evening, I drove to Jessie's place. She opened the door with a half smile, the kind people use when they're uncomfortable. I said, "You told me to post, to show strength." She said, "I didn't tell you to torch your life." I said, "You said he'd never leave." She said, "I was wrong." I said, "You think I deserve this?" She said, "I think you should have known better." When I left, I didn't go back to Ria's. I parked outside the old house again. Through the window, I saw a new family photo on the wall. Caleb, Ivy, and Clara standing behind them. My face was gone. Literally gone. The frame that used to hold our wedding photo now had something else. Ivy holding a sunflower. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring. Eventually, the porch light turned on. I thought maybe it was Caleb. Maybe he'd step out and say something, anything. But no one came. When I finally drove away, I passed the courthouse downtown. A banner outside read, "Family Matters Resolution Week." The phrase felt like a mockery. My phone buzzed with a reminder. Pre-hearing tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. I pulled over, opened the notification, and scrolled through the attached file my lawyer had sent. It was Caleb's affidavit, clean, factual, emotionless. The last line read, "This separation was not born from anger, but necessity." I read it over and over until the words blurred. For the first time, I understood he hadn't left out of revenge. He'd left to survive me. The morning of the hearing felt like the air itself had stopped trusting me. I dressed carefully, hoping I still looked like someone worth listening to. Ria offered to drive me, but I said I needed to do it alone. When I arrived, Caleb was already there, early, calm, sitting beside Marta Bell as if this were just another meeting. He didn't look angry or proud. Just finished. The judge entered, papers shuffling like thunder. The clerk called our names. My lawyer nodded for me to stand. The hearing began. Marta's voice was steady as she presented each piece of evidence. Travel receipts, social media posts, Ethan's tagged photo from Paris. She never raised her tone. Each fact was its own quiet weapon. I tried not to look at Caleb, but my eyes found him anyway. He kept his hands folded, eyes forward, never once glancing at me. When it was my turn, I spoke about honesty, about how I'd needed space, about self-discovery. The judge asked if I'd informed my husband of my extended trip. I said no. The judge asked if I'd left our daughter without a clear return plan. I said it was a misunderstanding. Marta interrupted gently. Your Honor, Exhibit D includes the text message in which the respondent stated she was staying in Paris indefinitely. My mouth went dry. I said that wasn't literal. The judge asked if I could prove otherwise. I couldn't. Drew whispered for me to stop talking. My chest felt tight. I wanted to scream that Caleb had been cold for years, that I'd been suffocating, but even I could hear how childish it would sound here, in a room where words turned into records. Marta handed the judge one last folder, financial statements. She said calmly, my client acted within his rights to protect assets and ensure the child's stability. The judge nodded. Understood. Then silence, heavy and final. When the verdict came, it was like watching a door close slowly, inch by inch. Primary custody awarded to Caleb. Visitation for me, every other weekend. Supervised for the first 3 months. Financial accounts separated. Shared property retained by Caleb pending review. I nodded, even though my ears were ringing. The judge asked if I understood. I said yes, though the word felt like surrender. The hearing ended. I gathered my things slowly, hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped my purse. Caleb stood, thanked Marta, and began to leave. I said his name quietly. He paused, turned halfway, waiting. I said, I didn't mean to ruin everything. He said, you didn't ruin it, you revealed it. Then he walked out. Ria was waiting in the hallway. She didn't hug me. She just looked at me like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I said, he's won. She said, no, he just stopped losing. Outside the sky was pale, almost white. People passed by without looking. I sat on the courthouse steps until the crowd thinned. When I finally checked my phone, there was a message from Jessie. You okay? I started typing a long reply, about the judge, about Caleb, about how unfair everything was, but then deleted it. There was nothing left to explain. That night I drove to the airport. I didn't even have a ticket. I just sat in the parking lot watching planes rise into the dark. I imagined Caleb at home reading Ivy a story, her head against his shoulder, safe and steady. I imagined her asking where I was, and him answering gently, something simple, something that wouldn't break her heart. My phone buzzed once more, an automated text from the co-parenting app. Custody transition begins Saturday at 10 a.m. The tone was polite, almost kind, like it didn't know what it was announcing. I watched another plane lift off, lights flickering against the clouds. I whispered, I only wanted to be free. The words hung there, useless. Freedom had come all right, but it had teeth. I sat there until the sky turned grey, until the world started moving again, without me in it. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.